Tonight we're going to talk about the reciprocal trig functions. So far in class we've looked at sine, cosine, and tangent, and we've talked about how they can be defined as the ratios of the sides of a right triangle, or we can define them in terms of the unit circle. Now for each of these, sine, cosine, and tangent, there exists what we would call a reciprocal function, okay? Also defined in terms of the ratios of the sides of the right triangle. So let's look at the first one. The first one is secant, and that is the reciprocal of cosine, okay? So we know cosine to be adjacent over hypotenuse. So that means that secant would be hypotenuse over adjacent if you're considering the sides of the right triangle. So if we consider this right triangle, we have angle theta here, the side opposite, the side adjacent, and the hypotenuse, which is opposite the right angle. Okay. The next one is cosecant, and cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So if sine is opposite over hypotenuse, then cosecant will be hypotenuse over opposite. Okay, and then lastly we have cotangent, and cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent. And so tangent is opposite over adjacent. That means that cotangent is adjacent over opposite. Okay. Now we can also define cotangent in terms of sine and cosine. So remember yesterday we said that tangent is sine over cosine. Cotangent would be the reciprocal of that, which would be cosine over sine. Now, sometimes students have difficulty remembering which one is the reciprocal of which. Tangent's easy because its reciprocal is cotangent. That makes sense. They kind of go together. So I have two ways that I suggest people can use to remember them. If you notice, we have secant and cosine, and then we have cosecant with sine. So one way that you can remember is that there's one co per pair. So cosecant goes with sine, cosine goes with secant. Okay, that's one option. The other option is that you can think C with S, S with C. So each of them has cosecant, C with the sine S, and then the same secant goes with cosine. So C with S, S with C. So you don't want to have two C's or two S's. So those are, two sort of useful ways to think about it. Now I also want to point out that if secant is 1 over cosine, then cosine could be 1 over secant. So you could also express it that way. Okay, let's put these into practice. So if we take a look at the first 3 examples, I'm going to leave the first one to you. So you can pause the video now if you want, or pause after you've seen me do one of the other examples. And we'll take a look at B. Now the reason I'm going to look at B is because example A is in quadrant 1, so that one we know is going to be positive. But I'd like to take a look at one where we have to consider how the quadrant affects the sign, S-I-G-N. Okay, so I'm talking about an angle in standard position. Remember, the initial ray is on the positive x-axis. 150 degrees brings me to quadrant 2. So that's 150 degrees. So we're in quadrant 2. We're going to consider our reference angle. So our reference angle is the 180, the straight angle, minus 150, and then we can draw down our right triangle. Okay, now we have a 30, 60, 90. You have the side opposite 30 is half the hypotenuse, and then the other side is radical 3. Now again, I reviewed last night, you could either say 1, 2, radical 3, or you could have x 2x and x radical 3, and then you could solve by setting 2x equal to a hypotenuse of 1, or you could use them in the unit circle. So the hypotenuse would be 1, the side opposite would be 1/2, and the other side would be 1/2 radical 3, radical 3 over 2. Either of the ways that we talk about are going to let you get the right answer. Okay. So now, if I'm at 30 and I'm looking for cotangent, cotangent is adjacent over opposite. So in this case, we'd have radical 3 over 1, or just radical 3. Then the next thing we're going to decide is the sign, whether it's positive or negative. So we'll remind ourselves of A, S, T, C, and then we're going to add a piece to that. So all of the trig functions, all 6 are positive in quadrant 1. Quadrant 2, sine and the reciprocal of sine, which is cosecant, positive. In quadrant 3, tangent is positive, and so is cotangent. In quadrant 4, cosine positive, and secant is also positive. Okay? So remember we said that in each of those quadrants, the A helps us to remember all, the S helps us to remember sine is positive in quadrant 2, T for tangent in quadrant 3, and C for cosine in quadrant 4. And we said the reciprocals are also positive, and I said you'll have to wait and we'll talk about that in the next couple of days. Okay, so if I'm in quadrant 2 and I'm talking about cotangent, that's not sine or cosecant, so that means that cotangent is negative. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to pause the video and you can complete A if you didn't already, and letter C. All right, so the next exercise is asking you to evaluate secant of 52 degrees, and 52 is not one of our special right triangle values, so it's not going to give you an exact answer, which is why the choices are decimal choices. I am just going to remind you about how to make sure that your calculator is in degree mode, and then you can do that question either at home or in class tomorrow. Okay, so just a reminder, you can do it on any page in the document. You would just go to Doc. We'd go to number 7 for settings, and we're going to change the document settings. We just want to make sure that the angle is set to degree, and then if it is, you can just hit OK. If it's not, you're going to set it to degree. If you want, you could make it the default, so that way all of the pages in the document that you're working on and the future documents will be in degree mode. That's option 1. The other option is on the home screen. You can go to settings, document settings, and then the same process, okay? Okay, so just like tangent has undefined values, because technically reciprocals are representing division, the other reciprocal functions also have the potential of having undefined values, okay? So we're talking about cosecant. Remember, cosecant goes with sine, okay? So we're kind of thinking about sine. And so essentially we're looking for where is sine equal to 0? Because remember, cosecant is like 1 over sine. Okay, so we're going to try to evaluate where is sine equal to 0. That's the question. Okay, so we're going to remind ourselves we got our little unit circle. Okay, and then we know that we have these coordinate points. So that's the point 1, 0. This is the point 0, 1, negative 1, 0, and 0, negative 1. Okay, remember, sine is your y value. So we're going to find where sine is 0, and that happens at 0 degrees, or 360 degrees, or it happens at 180 degrees. So in this particular case, 0 isn't on here as a choice, and 360 isn't on here as a choice, so we would go with 180 degrees, or choice 1, okay? Now, I would challenge you to find the same undefined values for your cotangent and also for your secant. Okay, let's take a look at the next examples, which are talking about finding the sign. Okay, and we can determine the sign based on what we know about sine and cosine and tangent and which quadrants they're positive. So we'll do one quick example, and then we'll talk about the last exercise 6. Determine the sign, and notice SIGN, positive or negative, of each of the following trig functions in the quadrant that it's specified. Okay, so we're looking for cotangent in quadrant 2. So if I think about quadrant 2, in this quadrant I know sine and cosecant are positive. So that tells us then cotangent, which is neither sine or cosecant, must be negative. Okay, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and complete B and C, doing that same kind of process. So determine which quadrant you're in, determine which reciprocal function you're dealing with. Okay. All right, and then you can also complete exercise 5. Just notice that this is saying cotangent is less than 0. That implies negative. Secant is greater than 0. That's telling you it's positive. So you're thinking about, okay, which quadrant does that happen? So a lot of times I will suggest that you kind of draw your quadrants and think about, okay, cotangent is negative in which quadrants, okay? And then secant is positive in which quadrants, and then find the overlap, and that'll give you the angle in one of those quadrants. We should also be able to produce all of the trig functions, and I promise that there will be a question like this on your test. This is a generic example, but you'll have an example similar to what's on the practice test where there are specific values and you're evaluating it for that. The first part of this question asks you to find the length of the hypotenuse in terms of A and B. Well, since we're talking about a right triangle, we can find the hypotenuse by using the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, and so if I solve this for h, I get that h is equal to the square root of a squared plus b squared. And then once I have all of the sides, then I can find the ratio of the sides in terms of a, b, and h, okay, or h, which is now the square root of a squared plus b squared. Okay, so if I look at sine of A, okay, that means we're here. Then I'm going to consider opposite over hypotenuse, right? So I have A over the square root of A squared plus B squared. Okay, and this is one of the few times that I'm going to tell you that you do not have to rationalize the denominator, because it's going to make it easier for us to evaluate the reciprocals. So if I know sine is A over the square root of A squared plus B squared, I know the cosecant of sine, the cosecant of A, the reciprocal of sine, will be the reciprocal of the answer that I got for sine A. Okay, so I'd like you to try and finish cosine, tangent, secant, and cotan, and then exercise 7. Exercise 7 is just like exercise 6, except they give you a specific value and they tell you which quadrant you're in, okay? So since it's positive fourth quadrant, it would have to either be first or fourth. In this case, it's the fourth. And you're going to find cosecant, okay? So first you're going to find the length of the missing side, okay? So we'll pretend we're in quadrant 4. We'll make our reference triangle, and we are considering adjacent over hypotenuse. So you're going to find that missing side, and then you'll be able to find cosecant, because remember, cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, which means it's hypotenuse over opposite. So you need to know the side opposite. All right, have a good night.